This is Justin with a quick note before today's episode. Beyond the Uniform is committed to helping military veterans succeed in their civilian career. In order to further our mission, we're launching a 2018 pledge drive. But rather than asking for donations, we're asking for reviews. If you have benefited from this show, please pay it forward by leaving us a positive review on Apple Podcast. There's a link in every episode's show notes, or just Google Apple Podcasts Beyond the Uniform, and it's the number one link. Our goal between now and December 31st is to get to 150 reviews. As a way of saying thank you, we're going to pick our favorite review and send you a free copy of every Beyond the Uniform publication. That's Veterans in Consulting and Veterans at Goldman Sachs, 2 softcover books, as well as printouts of our 5 ebooks. More importantly, your review will help us get this show in front of more members of the armed forces and military veterans. Thanks, and enjoy today's episode. Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and my goal is to help military veterans succeed in their civilian career. Today's episode number 207 with Liz Callahan.
The biggest fear that an employer or MBA program is going to have is that you can't think for yourself and you're not executing of your own volition. And what they want to see is that you're making decisions based on your expertise, because that's why an MBA program wants you, and it's why someone's going to hire you. They're hiring you because they think that you are capable of making the best decisions in whatever role it may be.
Well, for those of you who smoke cigars, you've probably heard the phrase knuckle burner. Well, I think that today is a knuckle burner of an interview. I found myself trying to use every last second to get Liz's insight, and Liz and I cover a lot of ground in this interview. We talk about her experience in unexpected departure from the military due to an injury, and the importance of being prepared for one's transition to a civilian career at all times. We talk about her experience in grad school admissions consulting, the importance of telling a story, translating one's experience, and emphasizing one's strengths. And we do a deep dive in the healthcare industry, including Davita, graduate school, a healthcare startup, healthcare consulting, working in an academic hospital, so many facets of the healthcare industry. And we also talk about having a side hustle and how to best utilize headhunters. So with that, let's dive in to my conversation with Liz. Joining me today in Norwalk, Connecticut is Liz Callahan. Liz, welcome to Beyond the Uniform.
Thanks, Justin. Happy to be here.
And for context for listeners, a few episodes ago, in episode number 187, I interviewed a friend of mine from Stanford Business School, Meredith Whipple Callahan. She talked about a book she just wrote called Indispensable, and she talked about a lot of advice around career transition. Meredith is married to Liz, and we had chatted about Liz's background. I thought it would be really interesting to have on the show. But to give you more context around Liz's background, she's currently a healthcare consultant at Callahan Partners. She started out at West Point, after which she served as a medevac Black Hawk pilot in the Army for nearly 5 years. After her military service, she worked at Davita as a program manager. She earned her MBA from UC Berkeley. She served as the Chief Operating Officer at Advon Healthcare, and she worked at the Stanford Healthcare System as both a program manager and a director of transition strategy. So we've got lots of different ground to cover here, a lot of different industries and backgrounds and roles that we haven't talked about on the show before, and so really excited to have Liz on. And so Liz, maybe to start things off, could you talk about how you approached your decision to leave the Army?
So it wasn't as much my decision as it was my left knees. I injured my knee when I was on deployment in Iraq. It was an aggravated injury that it started off as a sports injury at West Point, and I could no longer fly. And so when I was grounded from flight, the Army deemed me to be better service outside the military, and I was medically separated in 2008.
And I think for listeners, that's this is maybe out of 200 interviews, this is maybe 10 or 20, one of the 10 or 20 different interviews where the person I interviewed faced that unexpected transition. And I think that a lot of us, from my experience in the military, was there's a fair amount of predictability where when generally when you'll be promoted and you have a lot of job security. And I think, Liz, what you just shared is a good reminder of you never know what may happen in your life that may cut short whatever your intentions are for your military career. And I think it underscores everything else that we'll talk about on this interview about being prepared for that transition, because you really don't know when it will occur. And so, Liz, I will get into kind of where you go from here, from that unexpected transition in a second. But I wanted to start off the interview, just because I think this will be most valuable to everyone listening, is talking about one specific aspect of your career path. And that was you spent some time doing some admissions counselor work for an MBA program. And I'm wondering if we could start off with you sharing more about what that work was and what you learned about military transitions.
I've done a couple of different roles in admissions for MBA programs, and the route that I got there was a little bit twisted and built off of networking and the need for a bit of side hustle while I was doing some entrepreneurship. The first one was working for a startup out of Wharton, and it's called Admit Advantage, and I was one of their admissions counselors. And my focus was on a few certain MBA programs that I had good experience with, as well as any folks that came to them from the military. And it was really interesting to me because I had just recently gone through it myself and had a really excellent mentorship coming out of the military that assisted me in my process. And I was grateful that I was able to pass that along to the folks that I counseled in this program. One of the biggest things that I saw was the need for the individuals transitioning to be able to articulate their story to the civilian world, if you will. Being able to translate what they'd done in the military into corporate lingo in a way that showed what their strengths were. There's very little doubt out there in corporate America that folks coming out of the military have leadership experience, and that translates right to MBA programs. They know that the vast majority of individuals coming from the military have almost an untouchable experience level when it comes to leadership compared to their peers at the same tenure. That you just have the opportunity to do things that folks don't get outside of the military. And that's really valuable. But really what can set you apart from the other individuals transitioning out of the military and the vast number of qualified folks applying to top business schools is your ability to go one step further and show the opportunities that you had to build your logistics background, your operations background, people management background. There's so many specialties in the military that really give you a deep dive into expertise at a level that's highly competitive with folks that have been in the civilian sector doing it for the same amount of time. And so I saw the individuals that would come out and say, well, I didn't really do anything special. And I would just sit down and listen to a few of their stories with them and find out that you absolutely did. While you might not think it was special because you were just doing your job, when you take a step back and look at how important it was and the impact that you actually had on not just your unit, but perhaps the country, that takes it to that next level and really sets you apart from the crowd. And the other thing that I saw individuals coming out of the military that really needed help with was being able to translate their own language and to stop speaking like you were in the military. And I still fall into this myself. We had a lot of great shorthand, in my opinion, that made life a lot easier to converse and to send emails. And that's not the same way that you communicate in corporate America or with the MBA programs in the United States. And so taking a minute to just talk about basic communication skills almost, because you're so entrenched in what you've been doing in the military and you were probably highly effective at it. That changes when you get out, and some of the folks that were the best at communicating with their superior officers are now saying and doing things that can come off a little brash, a little short, and just an unintended manner. And so just being able to make the folks I worked with aware of that was really the biggest step in the process, because once you become aware of it and you can hear it yourself, then you're able to start to remedy that. That's great. And I just want to kind of unpack a couple things you said, because I think you just had a high
high density dose of great advice. So the first thing that you talked about there, the importance of translating your experience, I 100% agree on, and I think that that's a common challenge that comes up on the show. I love that you articulated how a common strength for military veterans is their leadership skills, and being able to explain that, being able to share stories that demonstrate that, and knowing that that's one thing that graduate schools, undergraduate schools, and organizations and companies would value. But I love that you also took that further and talked about teasing out those other specialties. And you named a couple like logistics or whatever that might be, but really delving into and reflecting on, okay, as based on my 5, 10, 20 years of military service, these are the 2 or 3 highlight skills that I really want to make sure that I demonstrate. I love that. And then I also like that you talked about learning that new language. And, this is something I see especially when people with a service academy background email me. I would say that 1 or 2 out of 5 will say very respectfully or V/R, which, this is just one data point. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Liz. But when I see that, for me, it's just a red flag of like, okay, this person is still in a military mindset and they haven't really transitioned. If I was viewing them from a lens of a hiring manager, my red flag would be, okay, if I have to teach them to drop that sort of thing, or sir is even, in my opinion, worse. It's like, if I got to teach them that, I'm just thinking like this person's going to be a lot of work because I've got to train them now, not just in the job, but in basic business communication and etiquette. And that's just my take. But one of the things I'd love to hear is any reactions you have on any of those things, Liz. But also I'd love to get into any advice you have on what are some practical tips someone could have around translating their experience and around learning that new business language.
First off, I think you're spot on. The signature block on an email is extremely telling. Don't think that people don't read that, because they do. And the very respectfully V/R are definitely red flags. Anytime that you're writing these emails and whatnot, it's very easy to Google examples of what it would look like if you don't have a mentor or somebody to reach out to help make that adjustment. And when you don't see that, then I completely agree with you. What you're going to get on the opposite end, whether it's an MBA program or an individual in corporate America, is someone who reads that and says, is this person a military robot? And that's the way that I always describe it to my clients. I say, the biggest fear that an employer or MBA program is going to have is that you can't think for yourself and you're not executing of your own volition. And what they want to see is that you're making decisions based on your expertise, because that's why an MBA program wants you, and it's why someone's going to hire you. They're hiring you because they think that you are capable of making the best decisions in whatever role it may be. And if they're taken aback by the way that you present yourself, that, oh man, this individual is going to need very explicit instruction, you're not going to be looked at the right level of experience that you're probably hoping to come in at. Whether that's into an MBA program, they're going to think you seem a little bit junior, or whether that's for a certain level of positions in corporate America, you're just going to seem a little bit immature compared to your peers. As far as advice goes, I mentioned one thing, which is just Googling around. There's some great examples out there. Make sure you're checking what you're reading. There are good examples and bad examples. For military folks, there are some great resources out there. This podcast is one of them. You can get excellent advice from individuals who have transitioned as well. So I can't stress enough the benefits of networking. There are going to be individuals from your unit. There are going to be individuals who commanded over you, individuals you went to school with, whatever it may be, that have already done that transition. And having them proofread something for you and providing feedback is going to be an excellent way for you to start to clean that up and very quickly learn some of the do's and don'ts. Because some of them are things that you wouldn't expect. I would imagine half the people that sign something very respectfully don't realize that is a red flag. They've been doing it for 10 years. They've been doing it for 15 years and had great success with it, like I said. So it's really a total shift of mindset. And it's not that you're doing anything wrong from your past life. It's that this new adventure that you're moving into is a different one, and it requires a slightly different skill set.
I love it, and I think that I hope that listeners don't find it triggering to hear that phrase. Liz's question was, "Is this person a military robot?" I think it's important to understand the maybe I would say uninformed stereotypes that hiring managers or admission personnel may have about a military person. And I would say it's safe to say that one of them is, that their stereotype, which I believe is false, is this person is following orders, they're doing what they're told. My experience has been that most people in the military are incredibly original thinkers and they come up with solutions under pressure. But it's important to understand the stereotype that you're up against so that, exactly as Liz was saying, you can start to find the ways to reverse that perception. And that comes from the very tiny tactical thing, like making sure you don't use very respectfully or use sir in conversations or in emails. But I love that it extends also to what Liz is saying, is like getting that experience, explaining your story, having another set of ears that can help you tease out the words or the specific diction that you're using that I love, Liz, that earlier you said that, someone who really excels in military communication, they're most likely going to face the biggest challenge in the translation. So realizing everything from the brevity to the way in which you communicate to the words you use are things that you're going to need to learn to adapt to fit into this new landscape and this new tactical environment.
Exactly.
And I also just want to point out for listeners, and I'll put the link in the show notes, Service to School is a great and free organization to help any military veteran in their applications for undergrad or grad school. Definitely check them out. And Liz had mentioned Admit Advantage. I'll add a link there as well in case you want to check that out as another resource. So maybe, Liz, just to kind of continue with your story, so we're at the point where you face this unexpected transition to a civilian career due to a medical condition. Could you talk about what your first job search was like and what ultimately led you to Davita?
I was really lucky that I had a battalion commander at the time who, first of all, was not excited about me being medically separated, but also was extremely helpful in my transition because he saw that it was unexpected for me. It wasn't exactly the path I was planning on. And like I mentioned, he had friends from school and individuals he had served with who had already transitioned. And so he was much senior to me at the time, and therefore so were these individuals. One of them happened to work at one of the junior military officer headhunting firms. And I didn't really know what other path to take, to be honest. I didn't know how to do the job search myself. I was a little bit restricted by the geography that I wanted to move to. I think if you're open to anywhere in the U.S., it's probably a little bit easier. So I contacted several of the junior military officer headhunting firms and signed up. One of them picked me up that was very invested in the preparation of their candidates. And so I had several rounds of interview prep, several rounds of resume creation and editing, and several rounds of basically education on the corporate sector, learning to say things like not say corporate sector in an interview, for instance. And so I learned a lot from them, and I actually took the information they gave me and was able to utilize that in all of my interviews. As I mentioned, my battalion commander connected me to an individual that worked at a different junior military officer headhunting firm, and they were very heavily invested in the part of the U.S. where I wanted to work. And so I went to one of their career fairs and randomly went to an information session the night before the big day of interviews the next morning, and my resume had really popped out to one of the healthcare providing groups that was there. And this turned out to be how I got my first job at Davita. Davita is the country's largest kidney care company and does mostly dialysis and has since branched out into several other areas, but is still mainly a dialysis company. They have a very strong culture there that aligns with many of the values from the military. They also have a high respect and regard for veterans and are very interested in recruiting them. And so the senior vice president that was there for interviews saw my resume and thought that my background in the Army, in the medical service branch, which is the Army's version of healthcare administration, I happened to be a medevac pilot within that, which also meant that I not only flew, but I was in charge of nurses and medics, medical logistics, and medical operations. So I had a pretty decent background, especially coming out of the military, for healthcare administration. And he saw that, picked it up, and said, I think you could be a really good fit. We have a home dialysis unit in Atlanta, Georgia that needs a good leader, and I think you'll be a quick study. And we talked, and it seemed interesting to me. It was kind of a new challenge. It's the area where I wanted to relocate, and some of the aspects of it directly translated to what my work in the military had been. I was going to be over the nurses. I was going to be running the logistics and operations, and I was going to be making sure that our patient care was top notch. So I accepted that role, and I actually started very shortly after I got out of the military. I only had about a 2-week break, right at the end of 2007, right into the beginning of 2008 when I transitioned, and I started in the middle of January. So it was a quick turnaround, and then it was an even steeper learning curve when I did transition, because while a lot of the aspects of the role seemed familiar, a lot of it also seemed foreign to me. And I don't want to gloss over that part, because it wasn't exactly just stepping into a new job and saying, oh, I got this. I had a lot of learning to do. I had a lot of change to do in the way that I led, the way that I communicated, as we've touched on, and the way that I thought through how things should be done. It was very different than the military, and it was a different type of leadership, because while I always prided myself on not being a leader who received people's compliance due to rank, but due to respect, when you lose that rank altogether, you're starting at zero, and that was something that was just a change for me, and it was an exciting time. It was a challenging time, extremely stressful for me to get going with it. But once I did, I felt like it was definitely the right choice, and I've really stuck with healthcare ever since.
And I want to delve more into your role at Davita, but I just want to unwind a couple things you just talked about. So first thing is, are you open to talking about providing the names of the headhunters, JMO recruiters you worked with, just so I can add those to the show notes?
Absolutely. So I worked with Alliance International, and they were the ones that did really thorough preparation with me. They were amazing. I actually recently wrote them a note to say thank you again. Because as I reflect on it and reflect on the work that I do with folks that are still transitioning, I realize how much they really did teach me. The firm that I ultimately landed my role with was Orion Talent, and they were amazing with the ability to work with me from a location perspective. And I had really positive experiences with both of those firms.
And if someone listening wanted to engage with Alliance or Orion or any military headhunter type of company, do you have any advice on how to approach that engagement?
I would say go into it knowing that they know much more than you, and their ultimate goal is to get you a job. So think about it that way. What you need to remember, because they'll be happy to assist you in this process, is that their goal is to get you a job. Make sure that they get you the job that you want, and don't just settle. I think it's tough for folks coming out of the military to take a second to reflect on what they actually want to do and what will ultimately take them to their next step. A lot of individuals that I've worked with end up taking roles just because they're offered to them, and they're a little bit nervous. I went through it myself. It's tough to come out of the military, especially if you don't know the transition's coming. And not have a role to go to. You've had a very steady job for as long as you served. So I would just caution you to make sure you're getting the job you want. Be very honest with them about what you are interested in and what you're not interested in, where you're interested in working and where you aren't. There are a lot of operation roles out there at wonderful corporations that would love to have JMO on a third shift, because getting an expert leader to work that type of shift would be helpful for them. Is that really the type of lifestyle that you want? It may well be, but it might not. And just make sure that in your process you're thinking about what's right for you, because it will go by very quickly.
I love that. And, I like that you said too, taking the time to find what's right for you. My wife, Rebecca, and I are looking to buy a home here in Denver. And I think it's a very similar relationship where obviously our real estate agent that we work with and who's been very helpful, he wants to help us find a great home. And he is commissioned on it. Like when we buy a home, he will make money off of it. And so there's just recognizing that is his financial interest. It's goes without saying to say, like, hey, it's really important that Rebecca and I take the time to find the home and the neighborhood and the backyard and everything that's exactly what we're looking for. And so I like what you're saying is that, like, yeah, of course there's going to be a company that would benefit from you working that midnight to 6 a.m. shift. And that may be a great fit for you, but it's also worth pausing and taking a second to say, like, is that what you want? Is that what's right for you? Given that both the recruiter and the employer, it works for them for you to take that job, but just taking the extra second to make sure that's exactly what you want. And for listeners who are interested about this, I recently did in episode 189, I'll put a link in the show notes, Brian Henry, who works at Orion Talent, he shared more about how Orion operates, and he also shared more about his 20 years of work in military recruiting and some advice he's learned from that. A second thing, Liz, I wanted to dive into is I love that you had this great soundbite where you said, I was a Black Hawk medevac pilot, and that is the Army's version of healthcare administration. I think that was just a beautiful example of just on the fly translating your military experience into the civilian context, which is awesome to see. And I wanted to ask on that, especially I'm just thinking of people who are on active duty listening. Was your decision to go from what I would say maybe healthcare, an aspect of healthcare in the military to an aspect of healthcare in the civilian industry, was that motivated by this is something I did in the military and I wanted to continue in the civilian sector? Or was it more of, well, I built up this experience in the military and therefore I wanted to leverage that experience outside the military?
So a little of both. And I actually went to business school really reflecting on that question, because when I got out of the military, I went and worked for Davita, and I was worried that maybe I did only select a healthcare provider because I was comfortable in the healthcare space and I wasn't challenging myself, and it wasn't something that I actually loved and was passionate about. When I picked the Medical Service Corps for my branch out of West Point, I knew that one of the aspects of it that I liked was it was focused around healthcare, so it was focused around helping people, which was something that I just found myself to be drawn to. The other aspect of it is under that branch, it's basically every specialty you could ever want. I was a medevac pilot. They have very specific logistics. They have actual hospital administration. They have environmental officers. So there were so many opportunities under there. It was almost like I made the decision that required me to make the most minimal decision possible. I still had all these options open to me, and I went along the path, and it served me exactly how I would like. I couldn't have dreamed of a better route for myself, but I think your question's spot on, because it's exactly what I asked myself in business school. And I did not want to spend my time in business school focused only on healthcare, because of that exact reason. I was worried I was just doing it because I had done it before. And in allowing myself those 2 years to really think about healthcare, what it meant to me, and what other options were out there, I found that it was absolutely the right choice for me, and it was really what fulfilled me. And when I would talk about it, I would kind of fill up, and you could just feel the passion kind of stemming through me.
That's great. That's great. And because I haven't had a ton of people on the show who have worked in the healthcare industry, could you just provide a little bit more detail around, because you were at Davita for a little over a year, about a year and a half. What was it like as a program manager? And in particular, if you could just take us through a representative day, especially around kind of the timestamps of when you stop and start and the specific activities and type of work you're doing throughout the day?
So as I mentioned, Davita's dialysis provider, and I was working in an actual dialysis clinic. My clinic was specialized on home dialysis. So most people, if they are familiar with it, think of the clinics where individuals come approximately 3 times a week. They're there for 3 to 6 hours receiving a dialysis treatment. Then they go home and they come back the next day or 2 days later and do the same thing. My clinic was a little bit different. Our clients were able to do their dialysis at home, whether it was through home hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis. Won't get into the specifics of the actual medical functions that are happening there. But what we did is we saw patients. And so I was in an actual clinic setting. I would go into work at about 7:30 in the morning to make sure that everything was up and running. Usually, first patients didn't come until 8:30. And that depended on the physician's schedule, because the physicians would come usually once or twice a month and run a clinic, and their patients would come through and see them. And so we facilitated that. And when the patients would come in, we would draw their blood, which would then be sent out for lab results. We would restock them with all of their equipment and materials that they needed. So think about the logistical side of that. And they would speak to our dietitian and our social worker. And we didn't have a case manager at my site, but the social worker managed the broader sense of ensuring that their kidney care was balanced with any other medical care that they were receiving. Oftentimes, dialysis patients have several different issues that they're dealing with, and it's tough to navigate that if you don't have a full-time advocate working with you. And so our social worker would step into that role. And so anytime a patient came in, you can imagine now they're seeing their doctor, they're seeing a nurse or a technician who's drawing their blood, taking their vital signs, checking their medications. They're seeing a technician who's getting them all of their equipment and materials. They're seeing a social worker, and they're seeing a dietitian. That in itself is a pretty robust schedule for someone's day. And so their ability to have a pleasurable time while doing all of that in one day at our clinic was really what I was doing, was to make sure that it was working like a well-oiled machine, that everybody was able to go from one patient to the next without any hiccups, and if they did have hiccups, to be there to resolve them. And so I was oversight, if you will, when it came to the schedule and it came to any of the patient issues, as well as physician management. So ensuring that the physicians had what they needed when they got there, that they were able to schedule their clinic days accordingly. If a physician was going to be out of town, for instance, we would have to notify all of the patients and reschedule the clinic day, ensuring that they could come, because obviously the physician's time was difficult to reschedule, and our patients needed to have as much notice as possible to be able to be there. I worked usually through the full day, because we would do lunch and learns with the physicians if they were there over our lunch hour. It was remarkably educational, and you really didn't have a better teacher than getting a kidney doctor there to speak to us about what's going on with our patients. And I was usually there until after we closed at 5. I would make sure that we did all of our required steps when it came to locking up the medications, logging what was going on with all of our equipment, from refrigerators to the dialysis machines. You have to make sure that their preventative maintenance is noted, their temperatures are noted. All of this is done because when the state comes in to make sure that you're a safe facility, they check all of that. And so I was also in charge of all of the regulatory needs of the clinic, and would lock up and make sure that everything was good to go for the next morning, and for the cleaning crew to come in, because in a healthcare environment, obviously disinfecting and cleaning up at the end of the day with all the biohazard materials is essential.
That's great, man. I really appreciate the detail there. I think that gives listeners a really visual sense of what life is like here. And so you talked about this briefly already, but what caused you to go back to grad school? And I'm also curious your thoughts on how essential a graduate degree is for this sort of career path?
For myself, it was really that I wanted to balance out the leadership that I felt very confident in from the military, that I felt was tried and tested when I got out, and I felt like I had learned a lot and had grown a lot. I wanted to balance that with the basic business stuff, if you will. I was running a profit and loss statement and knew very little about budgeting, knew very little about any aspect of it, other than I needed to make sure that it stayed within its required range. And I wanted to learn more about the back end of the business. I could make the operations work. I could make the leadership aspect work, the people management work, and so on and so forth. But when it came to the back end, which I knew I was going to need expertise in if I wanted to progress out of kind of the front line, if you will, that grad school, specifically an MBA, was going to be probably the right next step for me. And when I was applying, I didn't realize how much of that need would be in the minority at business school. Most of the folks going in are traditional business school applicants. These are individuals who have been in the business world for a range of years, from about 3 to 8 right now, and they had a business background. They were going to learn, about a different area in business so that they could transition to a different field. Maybe they were international and wanted to move to a different country. All of these other reasons for going to business school. And I was going because I really needed like a bare bones business education. And there are definitely folks doing that in every single program across the country. Oftentimes they're known as non-traditional students. So you'll have folks that transition from being in theater, from being artists, from being any number of things, but just not a traditional business background. And I found myself falling more in line with those individuals and their needs in business school than I did the vast majority of my classmates.
Do you, for someone listening who wants to go to grad school after the military, do you have any thoughts on the value of going directly there from active duty versus getting a little bit of work experience like you did?
I go back and forth on this, and I think it's really individually dependent, and that's why I go back and forth on it. Depending on what you did in the military and depending on where you are in your life, what's going on with you at home, the decision will change. So in my opinion, if you're ready for a transition, you're ready to jump in and really kind of work at trying something new, then you can go straight into the corporate world. If you need a little bit of time to figure out what direction you need to go or want to go, and you need to learn a little bit more about what's out there, business school gives you the opportunity to explore, to be around those traditional students who can help educate you. And it would be the same in any graduate program. So if you're going into some sort of specialty, Master in Public Health, for instance, then you have these individuals that have probably been in roles that you would be interested in, or at least worked around the type of role you'd be interested in, and you can get exposure to it there. So there's a lot of learning that can occur. But like I said, it depends on where you are and what you're ready to do. And that's something that takes a little bit of just self-reflection on your part. And it's not necessarily easy to tell. So there's going to be no harm in going directly to the working world and learning something and then realizing, you know what, I should go to business school, or I should go get my graduate degree in X, Y, or Z. There's also going to be no harm in going straight into a graduate program. The only thing is you won't have as much experience. So when I was applying, I had my military experience as well as some corporate realm experience. It just made me a little bit different candidate than what they were used to seeing from military personnel. Doesn't mean that you can't do either or and be just fine when it comes to admissions.
I think that I appreciate your perspective on that. I would just add too, because I went straight from 5 years in submarines to business school. And one thing that I'm jealous of with Liz's story is I just think of, the cost for me, I think it was like about $60,000 a year at Stanford for business school. And if you look at the maybe cost per hour or cost per insight, a lot of what I was learning was just I mean, bare bones, basic business stuff. And I'm at one of the best business schools in the world and using my time in education to learn just very fundamental principles. And so I'm envious of Liz's experience because she got a lot of that learning out of the way at Davita, I'm imagining, while being paid. She learned business terminology and basic business skills and etiquette. And that's one thing I regret, is not having learned those things in a more efficient way. And I think for me, it would have allowed me to go several layers deeper at business school, because I would have had at least some basis and understanding and then could go deeper from there. So that's just one thing I'll throw out for listeners, is just a alternate viewpoint on that too. And so Liz, you had a brief stint at a startup, and then you went to Advon Healthcare as their chief operating officer. I'd love to learn, as we continue this healthcare journey, what led you to Advon and kind of what they were when you joined them, and what your work was like as a chief operating officer or COO.
Advon Healthcare is a company that goes into post-issue nations and facilitates their healthcare transformation. That can present itself in many different ways. When I was there, our main goal was to take a special forces medic type of individual who has extensive training to the level of almost an emergency room doctor, and place them into what, again, I'll explain what this is in a second, but post-issue nations into remote locations to help build out a healthcare infrastructure. And so a post-issue nation could be an area that's been war-torn. It could be an area that's been ravaged by a natural disaster, for instance, or an area that has been under different government policies that are now lifted that are allowing the remote locations to have their own healthcare facilities. And what we were looking to do was basically take these experts, put them out in the field, and almost do grassroots healthcare development. This was all stemming from, as you can imagine, from my background, what I actually saw on the ground when I was deployed, and thinking to myself, if they just had the right person here, this village wouldn't need my helicopter to come in and pick them up and take them to Baghdad for care. And man, what happens when we're gone? No one will be here to do this. And I'm not talking about individuals who were injured in battle. I'm talking about civilians who were injured in their own kitchens. And so for me, it was very personal. And the way that it came about and how I was notified of this was through LinkedIn. And at that point, I'm going to be really honest, I think my LinkedIn profile was pretty bare bones. But a West Point graduate, he's class of 93, was looking for a certain type of person, and my profile popped out when he put in all the right keywords, I guess. And he reached out to me and kind of pitched me his vision. And he was the CEO of the company. He introduced me to the board of directors and advisors, and I spoke with them, and everyone was just so passionate about the possibilities of this company. And I was very lucky to be a COO under this type of CEO. He was extremely upward and outward thinking. He did all the strategy. He was doing all of the growth externally, developing the international relationships. And then he pushed back to me, who was looking downward and inward on all of our operations to make this work, to find those special forces medics, to develop the right standard operating procedures for our folks to go out into the field, to figure out how we were going to resupply them, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't have the government, if you will, behind us like I did in the military, where when you need something, there's this wonderful supply chain that is set up to get it delivered to you in what I may have thought was not fast enough, but was an extremely efficient form of delivery when you're overseas. And so my job was to basically from scratch create that, because this was a new startup. And I worked there and loved it. I had a real passion for the work and found that shared with really everyone on the team. Some of the biggest things I worked on were the development of our technology systems, so how the individuals in the field would be able to communicate with us when there wasn't a great deal of technology on the remote end, and our logistical supply chain, if you will, how we were going to make sure that these folks were resupplied in the field. I actually started, while I was working there, a little bit of my, what I called at the time, side hustle, which is how I found myself in admissions consulting, because my CEO was constantly doing rounds of funding, and I was always worried that I wasn't going to be able to pay off some of my student loans, as I'm sure many people can relate to that have gone to business school or any other grad school. And so I took on the side hustle of admissions consulting while I did that, which I let my CEO know I was doing, and he just laughed and said, I don't know actually how you find time in the day, but if you keep doing it, no problem. And eventually I actually got recruited out of that role to work at Stanford Healthcare. I was working remotely when I was at Advance. I lived in San Francisco, and my boss lived in near Memphis, and it was tough with the time change, with all the travel back and forth, that when Stanford reached out with another just remarkable opportunity, I thought to myself, this might be a better work-life balance for myself at this point in my life.
That's great, and I love that story of the side hustle and disclosing that to your employer, but also finding creative ways to make more money. And I know we're running short on time here, but could you just because I think one of the things I'm so excited about in talking to you is you've got so many different facets of healthcare experience. And could you kind of talk about, you spent, I guess, nearly 3-4 years at Stanford Healthcare and the hospitals and clinics. You worked as a program manager in transition strategy and as director of transition strategy. Could you just share more about what it was like working there and the types of work that you did?
So Stanford Healthcare is the hospital that's on Stanford's campus, for anyone who's not familiar. That makes it an academic medical center, which is a unique type of hospital. It means that there's a med school attached to it, and that there are students that are within the program doing the bedside care with the established physicians. And that also means that there are many more politics associated, because you have the med school personnel who are extremely, extremely good at their jobs and are just world-renowned in their fields. And then you have the administration side of the house that's just trying to run the hospital day-to-day operations. And that can be really tough when it comes to budgeting, when it comes to hiring. You can just imagine how difficult it is to make sure that the right folks are getting the right money when there is any sort of constraint. And that was one thing that I really learned at Stanford was working that balance of it's not quite people management, because it's not as though you're over them, but it's individual relationship management and learning how to work with people, finding out the give and take of what you're able to provide that will then in turn make sure that you're able to have an established relationship with this person of trust and back and forth communication. And in my role, which was pretty unique to a healthcare organization, my job was really to help open all of the, and when I say all of, I did not work on every single one, but Stanford was doing a massive growth at the time, and actually still is. And I helped open different clinics, and then mainly worked on their hospital expansion, which is set to open here in the not too distant future. And what I did is I was the liaison between the operations team and the construction team. So making sure that what the operations teams needed, whether it be a certain type of equipment or they need hand sanitizers in a certain place because of the work that they do, all of that translated over to the construction team and the design team, so that in the end, not only was this building beautifully designed, very smartly created, but it was also effective for the operation personnel as they moved in. And that's a really tough thing to do when you're talking about huge square footage of space with really specialized folks in almost every single room. And I worked on that for, as you mentioned, about 3.5 years, and learned a ton, because as I've discussed, none of my background was actually within a hospital, and hospital settings are different from clinical settings, and they're very different than the work I've been doing at Advon. And I, again, to get the role at Stanford was kind of networked in. I was talking to a alum from Berkeley, and she said, I'd seen a role, and she said, actually, I think you'd be perfect for it. And then very quickly thereafter, the vice president over that gave me a call, and that's how Stanford works. So I wanted to plug that mainly because I kind of just realized, as I've explained this, all of my different roles have come from some sort of networking, and I would actually be an individual who would tell you face to face, I do not enjoy networking. But when you do it and you're just even lightly engaged in it, it can turn out in an extremely positive way. And for me, I'm very grateful for all the opportunities it's given me, Stanford being one of them. What I also did at Stanford was worked with a team that included different specialties. So I had some folks that were on our team that were more design oriented, and Stanford, as well as the actual university too, is very into design thinking and incorporating that into really any work that you're doing. And so we had some design thinkers that we worked with. We had performance excellence, which is a process improvement team that we worked with. And then we had all of the operations personnel. I specialized with the teams from the lab, from radiology, from the emergency room, and so on and so forth. So I had the opportunity really to sit down with every single group in the hospital, learn how they did things, how they wanted to do things moving forward, and what they needed in order to do that. So that education in itself is priceless. I mean, Stanford's one of the best in the world, and I was able to hear from those experts how they did things. So it was a very quick education, and then a lot of rewarding work to help them get what they needed in those new facilities.
And I know we've only have a couple minutes left here, but what would you want listeners to know about? I mean, it seems like from an external standpoint, you've built up a lot of what Cal Newport would call career capital. You built up a significant amount of career capital in the healthcare industry. What motivated you in starting your own consulting practice, and any advice for veterans that aspire to pursue that form of entrepreneurship?
My change really came from my family's move across the country. We'd been located in the Bay Area, and I don't think I would have left Stanford had we not relocated to Connecticut for my wife's job. We sat down, and in true military fashion, I made us do a decision matrix to make sure it was the right call for the family. And it was, and we moved. And in doing so, I needed a couple of surgeries left over from some of my military injuries, and took a little bit of time off from work as we made the move across the country. And very quickly thereafter, some of my old employers reached out, seeing if I could do a little bit of work here or there. And I decided, this is something that gives me a lot of flexibility. I can work from Connecticut and still work with some of my old colleagues in California. And I can make decisions on what types of jobs I take and what I don't. So what's working out for me. So that's really what made my decision, was a little bit of being forced to change roles due to the move, and then also seeing an opportunity for extreme flexibility. And we have right now one 2-year-old daughter and a little man on the way in a couple weeks here. And so I wanted a lot of flexibility with the family work-life balance because I knew that my wife's role was going to continue to be kind of your normal corporate job. So the consulting gig really worked out there. My advice to anybody who wants to do it is you need to make sure that you have some warm to steady connections already going before you jump into it, unless you have the investment background or financial backing to kind of spin your wheels as you build out your network of clients. For me, I didn't want to really take a risk where I needed funds to be coming in and didn't have any clients, and was lucky enough that wasn't an issue. But everybody's situation on that's different. And then from the entrepreneurship side, just make sure that you, the bare bones of it, the legal stuff, you get down, have a good accountant, a good lawyer, and a good second set of eyes to help you read through things so that you don't miss anything in the fine print. But being your own boss is pretty great. My daughter's out of school this week, and I was able to, take her to the Children's Museum this week. And I have a lot of really fun individual time with her that is not often available if you're not your own boss. So I recommend it to folks that enjoy working hard and don't mind working alone or remotely, because obviously in a small consulting practice, mine is really just myself and some of my wife with her book and whatnot, some of her other work there. But, I am an introvert by nature and really enjoy being able to put my head down and get stuff done on my own time and dictate that schedule myself. So lots of pros, and then there's definitely some cons that are pretty well known about the risks you take when you step into business with yourself.
Well, Liz, occasionally I'll have a cigar, and they call really good cigars knuckle burners, just because you want to keep smoking the cigar and it burns down to the point where it's painful to continue smoking, but you continue to do it anyways. I feel like this has been a knuckle burner of an interview, and that we've covered so much ground and went way longer than I planned to, but I just appreciate the thoughtfulness you bring to all of the questions, and you have a very unique story in that you've experienced so many different facets of an industry. And I thought that your last answer here about the starting your own company just really also, continued that trend of providing so many different facets to it. So I really appreciate your time today, and I don't want to keep you any longer, but I always want to keep the last question open-ended, and that's just that we've covered so much ground, and I'm just curious if there's anything we didn't talk about that you want to make sure that you share with listeners before we wrap up.
No, I want to say thank you for having me. I hope some of the content is helpful to some folks. And my just parting advice to listeners is there's a lot of available expertise out there. You just have to find it, and it's not that hard. So make sure that you do a little bit of diligence before you make any of your big decisions in life.
This is awesome. Well, thank you so much, Liz. For listeners, in the show notes, you'll find links to everything we discussed. You'll find a link to Liz's LinkedIn profile as well if you want to learn more about her background and the work she's doing. And thank you. And I know as well that Meredith's interview was exceptionally helpful, and I know that as she was writing, based on your experience transitioning yourself as well as your admissions office, I know that you were a big help to her in writing that book, and in many ways it was a joint effort. So thank you both for supporting the show and for the advice you've shared.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and I know that Meredith enjoyed her time a couple weeks ago.
Surface.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond the Uniform. There are over 200 free episodes at beyondtheuniform.io. They're classified by the industry of focus, the functional role the person plays, and more. Beyond the Uniform is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Justin Asiri. Our Director of Outreach, responsible for sponsorship and guest episodes, is Steve Bain. Our editor, responsible for the show notes and text transcripts for all episodes, is Kathleen Dillon. Our data analytics and insights advisor is Andrew Woolridge. If you are enjoying Beyond the Uniform, you can help us out by telling your veterans and friends in the military about this free resource. There is more information on the website about how you can sponsor an episode or donate to our program to help us grow the work that we're doing. Be sure to check out the coaching section of beyondtheuniform.io, where you can be paired with professional, subsidized coaches to help you figure out your next career move. You can sign up for our newsletter to be up to date on the latest happenings at Beyond the Uniform. And in each show notes section, there is a link to audible.com, which is providing a free audiobook of your choice to Beyond the Uniform listeners. You get a free book of your choosing, and Beyond the Uniform gets $15 to subsidize the cost of the show, regardless of whether you continue with audible.com or not. Check that out and more in the show notes for this episode. Keep the feedback coming. Let me know what resources would help you in your career, and we'll do our best to make that happen. Take care, be safe, and I'll be back next week with more interviews with military veterans about their civilian career.